In 1942, exiled leaders of countries overrun by Hitler met in London to discuss their response to German war crimes. Even before America had entered the war, German massacres of civilians prompted Roosevelt to declare that punishment of war crimes would be counted among the major goals of the war. In January 1945, the Allies invaded Germany. In April 1945, American troops moved into Nuremberg, the spiritual home of Nazism. The great stadium that Albert Speer built for the Nuremberg rallies lay silent. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. The Germans were a beaten, dispirited people. Many had nothing to do with Nazi atrocities, and many had.
World War II was both a war and a crime. Millions of innocent people were killed, and millions more lost their homes and property. The victims cried out for justice. Those who brought this suffering must be made to answer for their crimes.
After World War I, the Allies had decided in the peace treaty that people accused of war crimes should be tried. And one of the many concessions made to the Germans after the First World War was a change which the Allies had agreed to in the Versailles Treaty, that the Germans would try these criminals themselves. Well, that proved an absolute and total fiasco. And the Allies were not about to try that a second time.
Near the end of the war, the Allies organized a War Crimes Commission and set up a system for bringing criminals to justice. The commission decided that individuals who committed atrocities against persons or property would return for trial near the scene of their crime. Individuals accused of specific crimes, like killing prisoners of war or downed airmen, would be brought before military courts. An international tribunal would try the major war criminals, Hitler and the men of his inner circle. But Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and other high-ranking Nazis committed suicide before they could be arrested. The election of Nuremberg was only fitting. During the 1930s, the city's destiny marched closely in step with that of Germany's Führer and the Nazi Party. But the practical, rather than the propaganda reasons, brought the accused to Nuremberg. The Palace of Justice was the only large courthouse that had survived the Allied bombing raids. By the end of September, 22 Nazi leaders, men who once controlled the fate of Europe, sat in Nuremberg's tiny cells.
Nuremberg at that time was, in his words, in terrible shape. There being no telephone communications, the streets full of rubble, with some 20,000 dead bodies reported still in it, the smell of death hovering over it, no public transportation, no shops, no commerce, and no life.
Robert H. Jackson was born in 1892 in Spring Creek Township, Warren County, Pennsylvania. At age 5, he moved to Frewsburg, New York, where he attended schools through high school, where he graduated in 1909. In 1910, he attended a postgraduate year at Jamestown High School. He did not attend college, but did attend 1 year of law school at Albany Law School. Became a member of the bar in 1913, practiced law in Jamestown for 20 years, and thereafter, through a variety of appointments, became Attorney General, Solicitor General, and ultimately Justice in the United States Supreme Court.
Him because he having been born in Warren County, in Spring Creek, he was well known, and of course he was establishing quite a career, and he was and I remember he was working, he was attorney for I believe the telephone companies, you know, in the Jamestown area and everything, and he had a good record, and every time he did anything, and especially when President Roosevelt brought him to Washington to be his Solicitor General, he had quite an outstanding record. So you just normally followed it because you were interested.
Is there a sense of community pride?
Very much so. You know, and you looked at it that now this is most unusual for someone who was born in Warren County and was doing his law practice in Jamestown, New York, had attained such a high status.
Yeah.
And it was just a sense of pride, not only in Warren County, but all of Chautauqua County.
I was born and spent most of my life in Warren, Pennsylvania.
The notion that there ought to be a trial under international law took hold and was really exemplified by Justice Jackson, Robert Jackson, who took leave from our Supreme Court and strongly advocated running a trial, which in my view had lots of merit, because if nothing else, it was going to establish, forgetting the legal aspects of it, it's going to establish the Nazi record in an indelible fashion, which would not be open to counter.
The first of 13 Nuremberg trials commenced 6 months after the war ended. In November 1945, American Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson arrived in Germany with the hope that the trials would destroy the lingering attraction of Nazi ideology forever.
When our paths crossed again, I had been ordered to go into Nuremberg because the group that was in effect headed by Jackson, they naturally, we have to remember that it was the end of the war. They were conquering heroes, and unfortunately, in many instances, they acted that way. And there was certain acts of depredation and that type of thing. And of course, there were all kinds of motor vehicle accidents and incidents, and in most cases, in most instances, what happened was that when I say we, I mean the American Armed Forces were at fault. Like there'd be a traffic accident between Strassenbahn, the streetcars, and our people, and what had happened was that they didn't even bother to file any reports or anything else. And it was a position of the United States, properly so, that we had to start conducting ourselves properly and be responsible for our actions, whatever they may be.
Resigned to an American presence in their country. The Americanization of Europe was underway. For Germans, daily life in Nuremberg was a dreary routine. The city was a desolate, haunted reminder of Nazi ambition. Poverty and hunger contributed to the stony-faced gloom of Germans as the Allies tried their former leaders.
To handle all of the various claims that were all of a sudden popping up in Nuremberg, because when they moved in, that is, when the Nuremberg prosecutors and all of their staff and everybody moved in, and they started to do things the way things had been pretty much done right up until the end of the war.
So did you have to contact Jackson's staff?
So I had to contact Jackson's staff. There were a number of these things that we had claims that had been filed, and complaints and everything, and it was necessary for me to contact Jackson's staff, and the first thing, sit down with them and explain to them that this can't continue the way it has been in the past, because things were coming down from Eisenhower headquarters that everybody had to conduct themselves properly because the war was over.
Mm-hmm. What were you doing there?
To tell you the truth, I was on guard duty there.
Guard duty?
Yeah.
Prison guard duty?
No, really, what we was doing was securing the courthouse from intruders.
Ah, the outside.
Anyone that came in that had no business there was, in our eyes, an intruder.
Right.
Now, if it was Justice Jackson or Sam Bonita, they had the special identification.
Right.
And they had to show that every time that they came in or out. It didn't matter whether you knew them or not. I mean, even Justice Jackson, whose face was about as familiar as anybody could be, because he had been in the Stars and Stripes many times. We'd still stop him. In fact, I many times stopped him before I knew who he was even.
Sure. So you were stationed outside the courthouse?
No, we were actually just inside the entrance doors.
Ah, okay.
On Nuremberg's Palace of Justice converged the trial's massive cast of characters: judges, lawyers, interpreters, translators, and, in the adjoining prison block, well guarded, the principals themselves.
Through the staff, that's how you actually met Bob?
That's how, right, that's how I saw Justice Jackson, and of course, I just, the few times, you know, I met him and everything after the first time, telling him where I was from Warren, Pennsylvania, and of course he said he had been born in Warren County. I says, oh yes, we all know that, and he just remembered who I was, and I told him that someday I'd be back practicing law in Warren, Pennsylvania. And,
what kind of guy was he? Describe him.
He was very pleasant, and he was one of those individuals that he looked the part of an important person. He carried himself well. He had a pleasant approach, a winning smile, and he was friendly, and he was someone that you felt comfortable with, and of course, you know, the fact that I was, at that particular time, I was a neophyte lawyer, was interesting to him, because he knows, I mean, he remembers what he went through and everything. And of course, the fact that even at that time, I knew I knew of his work with the utilities and everything, and he was considered one of the best in the country, and that's why President Roosevelt made him go to Washington, and he started to move up the ladder, and knowing everything he did. Of course, I wasn't the only one, but anyone, as I say, that was from Warren County, that was overseas, we all knew everything that Justice Jackson had done. Of course, Bob Swanson, I had known Bob Swanson from grade school, you know, probably from the time he was in second or third grade, you know, and we grew up together. And
one of the highlights for me was that day when I'm going up the steps of the courthouse there in Nuremberg, and I keep referring to it as the courthouse steps. I don't honestly remember whether that was truly the courthouse. I know it was where the trial was held. That much I do remember.
Yes, it was really a chance encounter because you know, I happened to see, well, as you're walking along and you see a group of fellas that are just like you see in this picture, that are looking over, you know, they're all dressed up in uniform, they're on guard duty and everything, and he was on duty, and you know, you look at somebody and, hey, I know him. That's Bob Swanson, you know, that's a type of thing, and I just happened to be at the time with Justice Jackson. I can't even remember what we were talking about, you know, and we were chatting about Warren County and Jamestown, you know, at the particular time, and that's when we ran into Bob.
I'm going down the steps, coming out of the courtroom, and here's these guys who I'm not paying any attention to going up. And all of a sudden I heard somebody say, "Oh my gosh, it's Bobby Swanson from Warren." Well, of course, when I heard that, you know, I turned around because there was a bunch of GIs going in and out of there, as far as that part goes. I turned around, and all of a sudden I said, "Somebody say something about Swanson?" He says, "Yeah, Bobby," he says, it's Sam. He says, I got somebody I want you to meet." And I said, "Oh, who?" And he laughed. He says, "Justice Jackson."
I'll be darned.
And with that, this guy walked over, put out his hand, he shook hands, and he says, "Well, if you're from Warren, then you know where my hometown is." He says, I'm from Frewsburg." And I said, "Oh, was anybody left after you left?" I said, "Was there anybody left in the town?" And we joked a little bit. And I said, "You know, I've been reading a lot about you, Justice, in the Stars and Stripes." And he says, "Yeah, but," he says, they make it sound like I'm somebody important." He said, "I'm really not that important." He says, "But anyhow," he says, "as long as you're from Warren," he says, let me say my name's Bob Jackson." And oh, he was just such a pleasant person to talk to.
Right.
And of course, call it hero worship or whatever you want, but hey, this man had been written up so much in Stars and Stripes, not only in Stars and Stripes, but in the newspapers here in the States. And because he, as I remembered, I may be wrong, but as I remembered, he was already a Supreme Court justice.
Correct.
And
I just introduced him.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's just like, really, and Jackson, he didn't put on any airs or anything. He was friendly as could be, just like running into somebody the same as the way we're sitting here at the present time.
Yeah.
You know, it was just you know, one of those things, you know, here's Justice Jackson, and of course, he knew who Justice Jackson was, of course.
Sure.
So it was just a friendly introduction, and then we just kept going on our way, and he had to, I'd forgotten where he was going, back to his office, and I was going over to see some of the people that were in his various offices. So it was just a pleasant gathering, and of course one of those unforgettable things that you run into from time to time.
Sure.
The most unusual sight to see the Germans that were charged, to see them all in the box. All of these various people that you had been reading about, thinking about, and there they were all together as a group and being tried as a group. The here at the left of actual people in the concentration camps, just let me digress a minute. I visited Dachau and one other camp, and it was really something to see all these people. Their bodies were emaciated. They were just skin and bones, and they were even too sick to move, and they kept them, you had to keep them in the concentration camp where they were. And the two that I visited a number of times was Dachau and Buchenwald. Both of them were famous, rather infamous, and it was a really a mind-shattering experience to see the ovens and everything that was to move them out as fast as they could, because they had to completely check them. They had to take tests to find out what disabilities they had at the time before they could move them to a regular army hospital or a place where they could start treating them and doing something about them.
And you sit down, and then you see these defendants walk in. What'd you think?
Well, it was a revelation in that all of them looked like you could go out into the street and they could be part of a crowd. You wouldn't even know who they were.
Yeah.
Because they, and of course they were all highly intelligent individuals, well trained, had good backgrounds. It struck you that here were people that once upon a time were normal, average, everyday people that now had committed and had been charged with committing all of these various atrocities.
What were your impressions upon seeing Hermann Goering for the first time?
Mm-hmm.
He's got to be the star defendant.
He was. He was. He was the one that stood out amongst all of them. And he was shrewd, brilliant, and of course the way he committed suicide was right under everybody's nose.
Yeah.
You know, just unbelievable that he could do that, because they were checking him so closely, watching him night and day, and yet he managed to secret that those pills, poisonous, that did him in without anybody knowing what he was doing.
Of the Nazi conspirators was Hermann Goering, who had been Hitler's number 2. Goering was indicted on all 4 counts, from planning aggressive war to crimes against humanity.
First, did you proclaim the Nuremberg laws?
Als Reichstagspräsident, jawohl.
Eheschließungen zwischen Juden und Staatsangehörigen deutschen oder artverwandten Blutes sind verboten.
That was the beginning of the legal measures taken against the Jews, was it not?
Das war eine legale Maßnahme.
I assume that that is the only kind of government that you...
Goering dominated the proceedings for 3 days. His aim was to put on record a defense of the Nazi regime.
Unter den damaligen Umständen war sie nach meiner Auffassung die einzig mögliche Form, und sie hat auch gezeigt, dass Deutschland aus seinem tiefen Elend der Verarmung und Arbeitslosigkeit in kurzer Zeit zu einer verhältnismäßigen Blüte wieder gekommen war.
I trust the court is not unaware that outside of this courtroom is a great social question of the revival of Nazism, and that one of the purposes here of the defendant Goering, I think he'd be the first to admit, is to revive and perpetuate it.
It's a sort of panic took in. Is this man going to get away with it? Because after all, he was the leading Nazi president. And at this point, David Maxwell Fyfe, the Englishman, was called in, and he reduced him, but just by hard fact, no argument. Where were you when that happened? Where were you when that happened? What do you say about this? What do you say about that?
Witness, do you remember telling me last night that the only prisoners of war handed over to the police were these guilty of crimes or misdemeanors?
So habe ich mich nicht ausgedrückt.
Witness, the escape about which I'm asking you took place on the 25th of March. I want you to have that date in mind. The decision to murder these young officers must have been taken very quickly, because the first murder took place on the 26th of March. There must have been a meeting with Himmler or Kaltenbrunner in order that that order would be put into effect. Is that so?
That went on for 2 or 3 days, and by the end of it, Goering was a shaken and defeated man.
Have, other than maybe Rudolf Hess, was he there when you were?
Yeah, he was there. Yeah, there he is, right in the center.
Did you notice anything while the days that you were there where he was acting abnormally, or?
No, because he just seemed to be just sitting there.
Yeah.
The only impression was that he doesn't seem to be interested in anything that was going on.
Justice Robert Jackson, the chief prosecutor for the United States, prepares to examine Dr. Hjalmar Schacht, Nazi finance minister.
Dr. Schacht, you said in 1938, we have fallen into the hands of criminals. How could I ever have suspected that? I'm sure you would want to help the tribunal by telling us who those criminals were.
Hitler and his comrades.
I'm asking you to name all that you included in that category of criminals at that time. Hitler, you know, is dead.
Defendant Goering. I might also include Himmler and Bormann. As to the other members of that intimate circle, I do not know who they were.
You've named 4 men as criminals, 3 of whom are dead and 1 of whom you say admitted.
I might add one more name. I suppose that Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop knew of the plans of Hitler constantly.
Von Ribbentrop displays shock over this repeated violation of the prevailing strategy of Nuremberg defense, to lay all misdeeds at the door of men beyond the reach of the court.
I'll be very honest with you, I was so impressed with Justice Jackson that when I was in there, if he was talking, I was watching him.
Right.
Because you talk about starstruck, I sure was where this man was concerned.
The judges make some last notes as the trial approaches its end. On August 29th, 1946, the chief American prosecutor, Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, comes forward for his final summation.
These men saw no evil, spoke none, and none was uttered in their presence. When we put all of their stories together, this is the ridiculous composite picture of Hitler's government that emerges. It was composed of a number 2 man who knew nothing of the excesses of the Gestapo which he created. A number 3 man who was merely an innocent middleman transmitting Hitler's orders without even reading them, like a postman or a delivery boy. A foreign minister who knew little of foreign affairs and nothing of foreign policy. A security chief who was of the impression that the policing functions of his Gestapo and SD were somewhat on the order of directing traffic. A party philosopher who was interested in historical research and had no idea of the violence which his philosophy was inciting in the 20th century. Now, this may seem like a fantastic exaggeration, but this is what you would actually be obliged to conclude if you were to acquit these defendants. If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say that there has been no war, that there are no slain, that there has been no crime.
They viewed it with mixed emotions. You must remember Germany had been defeated, so they didn't think too highly of any of their leaders at that time. In fact, there was kind of a standing joke amongst everybody around Nuremberg that there's a quick way to handle this, is just turn all of these people over to the Germans. Yeah. And what they would have done is they would have found them guilty immediately. There wouldn't have been any long drawn-out trial or anything like that. And they would have hung them. Yeah. They would have hung every one of them. Yeah. This was their type of thinking, and of course we have to remember that it was a militaristic approach that they were using, and our government, with people like Justice Jackson, who were in charge of disseminating our approach, decided that we were going to do it in a way that was going to be as fair as could be under the circumstances. Yes. And of course they did find a few people, they just sentenced them to prison, sentenced them to jail, and they were held there in, I think it was Spandau prison, whereas a number of them were found guilty, and of course they were sentenced to death. So it was an unusual time, unusual circumstances.
For 10 months in this place, and 17,000 transcript pages of testimony. 19 of 21 defendants were convicted and sentenced. As Jackson put it, the evidence is there with such authenticity and in such detail that there can be no responsible denial of these crimes in the future, and no tradition of martyrdom of the Nazi leaders can arise among informed people. And he hoped to create a precedent that would make explicit that to persecute, oppress, and do violence to individuals or to minorities on political, racial, or religious grounds is an international crime. Today, 50-plus years later, the world is again witnessing an attempt to apply that precedent in new war crimes proceedings in Brussels and in Rwanda, to serve again as the voice of human decency following the unspeakable atrocities in Rwanda and in Bosnia-Herzegovina. We're following the path beaten by Robert Jackson for the protection of basic human liberties.
As far as I know, the only living witness to the Remagen Railroad Bridge going into the Rhine River.
Yeah, tell me about that.
People of Remagen loved their bridge. They loved it because it was an attraction for visitors from all over the countryside. And they loved to stroll across it on Sunday afternoons, to have picnics near the site of it. And they're right proud of the fact that the bridge was a strategic link between the German Ruhr on the north and the Saar-Moselle region on the south. Everybody knew that it would take a long amount of planning to cross the Rhine River, because this was the big natural barrier between the Siegfried Line and the straight shot toward Berlin. So even before we landed in Normandy, the Supreme Headquarters began to lay its strategic plans.
There was considerable argument as to how we should cross the Rhine when we reached the West Bank. The British argued, particularly Marshal Montgomery, that we should cross only in the north and make our attack north of the Ruhr. So that my plan was to cross the First Army just south of the Ruhr, and the Third Army under Patton to cross down somewhere near Koblenz, and then join them together and attack to sweep around the south and east side of the Ruhr and connect up with the 9th U.S. Division, which at that time was under Monty, on the east side of the Ruhr, and then clean up the Ruhr. As a matter of fact, we did do that later and secured something like 368,000 prisoners in the Ruhr.
The Remagen Bridge was still standing. His first reaction was, let's get some artillery down on that, because look at all those German vehicles and troops that are crossing. However, the order came back from higher headquarters, nothing except air bursts would be fired at that bridge.
Captain Friesenhahn was calling from the tunnel entrance. Captain Bradke, combat commander! I rushed over to him. Still completely out of breath, he reports to me, the Americans, they're at the Becher timber mill. This mill was located immediately behind the Rhine. In other words, they had reached the bridge. I told him, Friesenhahn, blast the bridge, blow it up. I have no permission. Major Schöller is the only one who can give the order for demolition. At that moment, Major Schöller was on the other side of the tunnel, 350 meters away from us, only to be reached on foot. So I dashed off through the dark tunnel to Major Schöller. I reported to him, the Americans are going to cross the bridge. Major Schöller is very calm. I said, Major, if you don't give orders to blast the bridge, I will do so. Then go ahead, have the bridge blasted. I ran back to Captain Friesenhahn. Back again through the dark tunnel. Again, minutes passed before I could reach him. As soon as he could hear me, I called out to him, Friesenhahn, blow up the bridge! Friesenhahn shouts, full cover, full cover! Everybody in the tunnel lies down flat on the ground in order to escape the tremendous blast we expected.
As far as we know, we actually saw the bridge lift up off its foundation. There was dust and debris thrown all over, and after a while, you couldn't see the bridge anymore. It wasn't too long. The dust cleared, the bridge was still standing. And Timmerman said, okay, move out.
Instinctively, my hand comes to my neck. I know. If the bridge doesn't go down into the water, my life will be at stake.
This bridge enabled us to get across the Rhine here without having to make an assault later on. And really made a decision to cross on a wide front easier for Eisenhower to make.
5 tanks and about 120 infantrymen across the Remagen Bridge, a pretty thin force to hold a strategic point like that. But the next morning, all of the American troops within miles around converged on the bridgehead, and within 24 hours, 8,000 American soldiers had crossed the Remagen Bridge.
It was funny because I was in an outfit called Field Artillery Observation, and we were up on a knoll, actually a hillside, just outside of Remagen. Telephone lines stretched across it, and I can remember my commanding officer saying, who I don't remember now even what his name was or anything, because that's back 60 years ago.
Yeah, sure.
But I can remember him saying, they told us to string our wire over here, but I don't know why. And at that time I was a corporal, and he says, Corporal, I'm going to tell you like it is. String your wires across that bridge. And he says, if you're like me, you wonder why, go ahead and wonder, but he says, you'll never get the answer.
Yeah.
And
Surprised that it was still up? As I understand, the Germans were blowing up every bridge across there, right?
well, yeah, of course, the trouble with me was, you have to remember I was a railroad brat.
Right.
That means my father was a railroader. And I was very partial to railroads.
Right.
And so I said, well, naturally the railroad bridge would stand up anything against anything the cross would do.
Right.
Command post in the cellar of the burgomaster's house at Erpel, and we commanded the development of the initial bridgehead across the Rhine River. Beginning that morning and continuing for a number of days later, there was a constant stream of American troops from the west bank to the east bank of the river.
The American Army engineers had laid probably 2x8s or 2x6s, I don't remember now, down so that the Army vehicle could drive over it.
I see.
And it was never intended to be a footbridge.
Right.
It was strictly built for a railroad bridge, and then between the rails, they laid this. Actually, it was 2x6s, 2x8s, and so forth, and we walked across that. Probably we crossed that bridge. In a 24-hour period, we probably crossed it 15, 20 times a day.
Okay.
Never again.
7 days, my unit, the Combat Engineer Battalion, worked hand in hand with a bridge construction outfit that was more or less in charge of erecting the dismembered pieces of iron and steel that were the upper part of the bridge. Ours was mainly the job of the flooring of the bridge. This was a railroad bridge, by the way. And we worked feverishly around the clock, 24 hours a day in different shifts to build a Bailey Bridge, to get treadway on the bridge so that we could give the boys some support or get some equipment to them that were fighting so hard on the other side of the river. During this time, there was constantly periods where enemy aircraft was coming in, strafing the bridge, dropping bombs, trying to knock this bridge out. There was artillery fire. We stopped periodically to get under cover for these. One time I remember, rather stupid of me, enemy aircraft came over, and as it did, I tried to find something to hide under, and it was the Bailey Bridge that we were constructing. And after the strafing was over, I realized that this is probably the worst place that I could have been, because if that bridge had been hit, I'd have been caught or trapped underneath there. But these are the things that you remember afterwards, at any rate. This was a constant turmoil. It was men racing against time, that we needed help for those fellows over there, and we were working real hard, equipment flying all over the place.
For that bridge, like, maybe 15 minutes before it went in the water.
My word.
Remember this officer saying to me, just before I made my last walk across it, he says, Corporal, he says, you got to remember, he says, that bridge could go down at any time. And I said, sir, if it goes down, it'll take me down with it because I can't swim. And he laughed and he says, I don't think even if you could swim, that you could swim the Rhine River.
Yeah.
And like rifle fire. And we looked up in the air as if to look for aircraft, but instead there was dust coming up, rising from the bridge, and it seemed to totter a little. And it seemed to sway toward us. And then the center section of the bridge started to cave in. We had trucks up on the bridge that part of it was on the center section and part on the abutment side, so that this truck, I can remember, just folded up like an envelope. Pieces of equipment and pieces of the bridge were tumbling down. And I think our first reaction was to take cover that either the bridge had been hit or for some reason that it was going to fall. And then just as rapidly as you can well imagine, that whole big structure disappeared in front of us.
Just before that, just before the bridge went down, because I can still remember my exact words, because we had what was known as radio silence then. And we were, under no circumstances, supposed to break that.
Right.
Well, I'll tell you, I sat up there on that hillside looking down, and my exact word was, oh my God, the bridge is down. So that I broke radio silence And quite frankly, at that time, I could have cared less.
Yeah.
No matter what they did to me, if they wanted to take me out, shoot me, that was fine. But I was going to let the world know that the Remagen Bridge was done.
Yeah.
And I can remember getting having a war correspondent come to the cave afterwards. He was a correspondent for NBC, and I can remember him saying, "Corporal, are you the one that announced that the bridge went down?" And I said, "You're damn right I was. Boy, that was my moment of glory, and I wasn't going to give it up for nobody."
Yep.
You know, when you're 19, you do a lot of things that you wouldn't do when you're 78. And
rapidly, as you can well imagine, that whole big structure disappeared in front of us. And now we're all running to see what we can do about fishing people out of the river. That it was almost a bubbling, roaring noise that it almost seemed like the river itself had been turned into a boiling pot with all this debris falling in and men screaming, and you could see fellows were hurt and grasping for something to hang on to and going down the river where eventually they were picked up. But ours was a case of real turmoil then.
And it was, I lost a good buddy. Went down with it.
Lots of reasons contributed to the collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge on the 17th of March. In the first place, the German demolition on the 7th of March had really shattered one side of the bridge and weakened it seriously. Then when the Americans put planking on the bridge to cover it over and cover over the holes which had been blown in the bridge, this added about 50 tons of weight to the bridge. There was a great deal of heavy pounding from the tanks and the vehicles that crossed. The German artillery shells tore a lot of additional holes in the bridge. Then there were the bombs that the Luftwaffe dropped on the bridge itself. One of the real reasons, I think, in addition to this, that contributed to the collapse was the amount of heavy equipment that the engineers moved onto the bridge. Cranes, electric arc welders, air compressors, all these things set up vibrations. The American artillery batteries, and particularly anti-aircraft batteries, that set up vibrations that caused all the ground to shake around the bridge. I don't think that you could say that any single one of these factors caused the collapse of the bridge, but the combination of them caused the structure just to weaken and die on the 17th of March.
I assume you had a chance to see them.
Oh, yeah.
How did you feel?
Quite frankly, I think like any other 19-year-old, I hated them.
Right.
Because in my estimation, it was their fault that my life was disrupted.
Every major victory in war is a result of long planning, long preparation, with the loss of often thousands of men. But when something comes along that is unexpected and you have this great prize, now there's a great alarm. In the other cases, you've expected it, you've planned for it, and here you come along with something that gives a great lift to the morale of the whole force, everybody. I think from private up to our bosses in Washington and London knew that the war was over. Every one of us realized that if Hitler had the slightest sense, he would immediately surrender. But it was the gallantry of the men that did it is something that should never be forgotten. And their names really ought to be in some, I'd say, permanent place in the...
I'm Kristen Stein, Director of the Fenton History Center in Jamestown, New York. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation, which is just one of many stories from our community's rich history. The Fenton History Center preserves our shared history through the presentation of educational programs and exhibits, the maintenance of a collection of local artifacts and archival materials, and a library specializing in local history and genealogy, all for the benefit and use of the public. For more information about the Fenton History Center and its activities, call 664-6256.